I work at the Darabont County Archives, Part 6D, written by JenniKinoShimatta. Sorry for the late update, but the history section on this part got a little out of hand. And I got trapped in a network of records and articles in the newspaper morgue that took me down a lot of rabbit holes. Miss Angie also tipped me off to some things. Hopefully you guys will appreciate this extra long update. I promise you the next part will be a little faster. After a pleasant night and another delicious greasy breakfast, we returned to Fraser Lake via the toboggans and packed into vans. Despite the disappointment at the sanitarium, we were in high spirits. Even our nighttime expeditions back in Castleton weren't truly overnight ghost hunts, so this was a great opportunity. It took around 2.5 hours to drive around Fraser Lake from the eponymous town to Cold Springs. The trip started with tremendously beautiful scenery until about halfway around the lake, at which point we entered the farthest edge of Cold Spring. Miss Angie used to live in Cold Spring, or at least she lived there for a time, and she warned me that the town had a bad feeling. No window dressing or anything. She told me point blank that if there were any truth to the rumors of the place absorbing the emotions of its residents over time, then Cold Spring was Exhibit A. It was gray. As far as the eye could see, it was gray buildings, gray land. Even the lakeshore looked drab and colorless. We drove for 30 minutes down Route 2, through the main drag of the town. And in all that time, we only saw a handful of people. It was dour, but also somewhat exciting. I mean, what better place for a ghost hunt than a ghost town? We had taken 2 vans from Precipice Bay since we needed the room for people and equipment. I was in van number 1 with Ken, Jamie, Alice, Downey, Meg, and Terry. We had the computers, cameras, and night equipment. Van number 2 had Steve, Kitty, Cecily, Jimmy, and Alex, along with the command post table, food, water, and camping gear. We rolled up in front of the bar around noon, and pretty much everyone got out to stretch their legs, use the bathroom, or smoke. Jimmy's dad had connections in Cold Spring since he would sometimes do demolitions or minor construction for the town at cost, so when Steve brought up the idea of visiting the hole, we already had an in. As it stood, we weren't supposed to meet the building supervisor until around 1, so we had some time to kill. The whole bar squats between 2 taller storefronts on Lim Street, just off Main, in the center of Cold Spring. The sign doesn't actually spell hole, but instead has a fat black circle on the marquee followed by a bar in all caps. There's a Goodwill store on the left and the Lucky Dragon Chinese restaurant on the right. The history of the bar, like everything in Darabont County, is complicated and a curious mix of facts and folklore. Thankfully, since this was a public business, unlike the secretive nature of the Esther Cavett Sanitarium, there are a lot more records, and let me just say this, it isn't anything good. Here's the overall business history of the location. The first business to occupy the location was Titicut Saloon. It opened in 1866 and closed in 1897. Then came Garan's Game Room, which opened in 1901 and closed in 1927. Then Reynolds Saloon, which opened in 1938 and closed in 1949. It was followed by Sapp's Tap House, which opened in 1956 and closed in 1977. Then the Glory Hole, opened in 1978 and closed in 1981. That was followed by the Bear Basket, which opened in 1981 and burned down in 1985. And finally, there was the Hole Bar, which opened in 1991 and closed in 1992. Okay, so the location has changed a lot of hands, but that isn't really surprising considering Cold Spring is something of a ghost town. and it has been for as long as the town has existed. The town has constantly whiplashed from feast to famine and then back again. It was one of the original 8 towns in the county, the furthest southern town in the county, and it made a name for itself in logging and trapping. It sits on the opposite side of Fraser Lake, and a derelict boardwalk/amusement area lies in stark contrast to the bustling water park of the town Fraser Lake. Cold Spring was built on logging and prospered for about 50 years. The town was incorporated in 1792. It then suffered when the industry moved north, then boomed again when it was on the main road to the steel mills in the south, but once again fell off around the Great Depression, only to rise again during the post-war period, then fell to its current state. The population of Cold Spring hovers around 300, and the average age is 56. It's a dying town, but there isn't really any other settlement nearby to absorb it, so it sits, slowly rotting to nothingness. Titicut Saloon was a bar and card den with a history of violent drunken fights. During one of the town's better periods, the chaos sown by the establishment proved too much, and it was forcibly shut down in 1897 for violence and a general air of venereal proclivities. Garan's Game Room was a bar and a brothel disguised as a card den/lounge. It was around during the days of Prohibition. Needless to say, it was discovered and shut down after nearly making it to the end of the dry era. Miss Angie told stories of the extensive basement complex where Stuart Dowd, the owner of Garan's, made his own hooch, shunting fumes through the chimney of the laundry next door to disguise his bootlegging. According to local legends, the constables were keen to turn a blind eye to Dowd's operations, especially given his supposedly exorbitant bribes. That was until his homebrew began poisoning the clientele. Reynolds Saloon and Sapp's Tap House don't really have any seedy stories attached to them. Just the stink of failed businesses exacerbated by low points in the town's history. The Glory Hole was where everything started to go downhill. Opened by an enterprising man named Colby Defrenze from Montreal, the Glory Hole was his reaction to Studio 54 and the club scene. Reasoning that Cold Springs was close enough to Montreal and Canada for partygoers, yet distant enough to avoid a lot of the public criticism aimed at sex-positive, drug-positive clubs in New York and the like, Colby poured a tremendous amount of money into extensively renovating and updating the building. He added a 3rd floor and extended the back of the building out into the municipal parking lot. Miss Angie remembers the club and even had a flyer from New Year's Eve, 1979. A garish, metallic gold slip with a sloppily printed logo and date. She said that it was a wild place full of uninhibited souls, untethered from the rigid constraints of civility. Coke, pot, heroin, and LSD were all over, and the club was drowning in alcohol. My estimation of Miss Angie grew when she told me about the LSD parties they'd have in one of the private rooms, and how her father disowned her when she'd come back high as a kite from partying at the club. Of course, with all the drugs and alcohol, there was plenty of furtive, seedy, embarrassing sex. Unlike some of the other times when Miss Angie would talk about window dressing and the distortion of the facts surrounding a story, she confirmed that the orgies would happen in the basement of the club, and that a sub-basement did indeed have a fully outfitted S&M dungeon. Looking at the police records and the archives of the Cold Spring Register, it became clear that by 1981, the year the Glory Hole was shut down, there had been 16 overdoses, 47 arrests for public indecency, a raid that resulted in 21 arrested for drug use/possession, and 12 deaths due to sexual misadventure. The club was shut down in February 1981, and Colby was run out of town. The Bear Basket opened in September of 1981 under the ownership of John Stieg. Hoping to capitalize on a repressed subset of the previous clientele, Stieg opened the business as a discreet gay sex shop. The front windows were blacked out. The front entrance was converted into a snaking corridor to prevent anyone from the street from seeing the patrons inside. And it operated on a strictly word-of-mouth capacity. Like the Esther Cabot Sanitarium, discretion was assured by the workers, and the strangely named property quickly caught on in the closeted county. Now, unlike the previous watering holes that occupied the building, the Basket was technically classified and registered as a specialty store. In other words, a sex shop. The majority of the storefront was high-end S&M gear, toys, etc. But it was the private rooms upstairs and the video booths in the back that really paid the bills. Miss Angie was a friendly patron of the store, and she's the source of all the salacious details. Unknown to City Hall for good reasons, and casually ignored by the single deputy stationed in Cold Spring, the Basket had an underground bar operating out of the back room, and an upscale saloon upstairs for more distinguished clients. The club room upstairs was also what ended Stieg's life as a free man. He was found guilty of manslaughter, procurement, kidnapping, and sex trafficking, and is currently serving several life sentences in a federal prison. You see, he was employing young men from around the country and from as far away as New York to work as entertainment for some of his more affluent customers. Miss Angie told me that the mayor of Cold Spring would occasionally pop in and drop $500 for a few hours with a couple of the young men. I suppose that all places have some place you can go for some paid fun. It just so happened that Stieg was paying his employees with heroin, and at one point towards the end, he essentially kidnapped a boy from New Hampshire. Anyway, the back room had a series of video booths, and you could get booze from the counter if you knew the code phrase. Miss Angie didn't. She says she didn't like the smell of the video booths, so take from that what you will. And if you really were in the mood, there were private playrooms in the basement. What Miss Angie did know was that at the time, the basement held a secret wall leading to even more extreme playrooms. Now, she acknowledges that some pretty nasty stuff went down in the basement, but warns that most of the tales are just distortions brought up by the stuck-up prudes. The end of Stieg's operations came on Wednesday, April 24th, 1985. When a fire began in the video booths and quickly spread to the rest of the store. The fire raged for several hours. You see, Cold Spring at the time didn't have any local fire station, and the engines had to be sent from Fraser Lake. By the time the fire was extinguished, the building's top 2 floors had been totally obliterated and 7 people were dead. Stieg was placed under arrest when the drug-addicted young men from upstairs had to be carried out by their clients, too high to even walk. 3 of the 7 victims were Stieg's boys from the club room. The other 4 being upstanding citizens in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is according to the Cold Spring Register. Miss Angie says that one of the victims was the comptroller for the copper mine. More on this later. And another was the town clerk for Fraser Lake. The next day was spent interrogating Stieg while the Fraser Lake Fire Department tried to sift through the skeletal wreckage. But as the region experienced 3 days of torrential rain and horrible flooding, little headway was made. It wasn't until Monday, April 29th, that the crews were able to go back to their investigation, and they made a grisly discovery. 6 men had been using the secret rooms in the basement when the fire broke out, and they were all trapped when the video booths upstairs collapsed the floor. With the entire roof and most of the walls down, the rain flooded the space, drowning anyone who hadn't already asphyxiated from the smoke inhalation. With 13 dead, the mayor arrested, Stieg facing serious jail time, and the authorities from Canada and the US converging on the town, you would think that Cold Spring would be forever tainted with the stigma of the killer gay sex dungeon. But I'm sorry to say the whole affair was forgotten in less than 5 years. Since Stieg was an outsider, and most of the dead were from out of town, the dirty business was quickly swallowed up by the collective malaise built up by Cold Springians. 6 years after the tragedy, the Cold Spring Beautification Committee decided that the condemned husk of a storefront had to go, and through some creative financial wrangling, Perry Kolchak, one of the executives at the Silver Lode at the time, was gifted the land by the town with a promise of wholesome reconstruction. Municipal records state that it was registered as a bar and grill only, with no residential occupancy, meaning the resulting one-story business would blend in with the rest of the establishments on the street and not be the sprawling monstrosity that Colby had built. Building plans kept the basements since it would be far too costly to fill them in, but eliminated the top 2 floors. The whole bar opened its doors on March 16, 1991, proving that the current generation's hipsters and gentrification movement doesn't own the concept of ridiculously asinine names. The grand opening had little fanfare, and within 6 months the bar had entered its death throes. The Cold Spring Register glowingly reported the food as delicious as any available in the county and beyond. The hand-formed burgers pair wonderfully with Chef Kolchak's homebrew lager, and the ambiance of the restaurant is sure to draw admirers from all across the state. The Fraser Lake Crier was less enthusiastic, stating that the food is good and the beer is cheap. Locals would be hard-pressed to find a better place to grab a burger and a brew. Needless to say, it didn't last a year. It closed its doors permanently in February of 1992. With the town economy in the toilet, and virtually no one living in the center of town, the location's been empty ever since. Once the building supervisor arrived, an obsequious brown-noser named John Lurch, and the conditions of our ghost hunt clearly understood, there was to be no fire or booze, and the electricity and water were on, etc., we started unloading the vans. The bar was a large rectangle and consisted of a large open space in the middle with square tables and chairs. Booths lined the right wall, and the bar on the left had restrooms and the kitchen in the back. A doorway between the bar and the kitchen led downstairs to the basement. It was surprisingly clean for a restaurant closed 27 years ago. I had assumed that Lurch or his cronies cleaned it up after Ken made the arrangement. We moved all the middle tables against the booths, and we set up a base camp before making a $200+ order from the Lucky Dragon. Now, there were several ghost stories surrounding the location, and we'd made an itinerary to maximize the roughly 12 hours that we would be actively investigating. We weren't being locked in. We weren't going to end up like Grave Encounters. So, some of the night was going to be spent where the Glory Hole's disco floor used to be. It's now a little park with an ivy trellis in the back parking lot. The stories associated with the hole fell into 4 categories: sounds, smells, sights, and direct action. It was that direct action bit that made Ken really excited. Supposedly, according to Steve this time, objects would move when you weren't looking. Bottles at the bar would mysteriously organize themselves. Doors would open or shut, and boxes in the back room, which had previously been the video booths area of the Bear Basket, would topple down despite being carefully placed on sturdy shelves. People reported the sounds of people screaming for help, pounding in the walls, the heavy scent of burning, and ghostly people walking through the kitchen or the basement. So, we divided into 4 teams of 3. Alice, Downey, and Ken were Group 1. Alex, Jamie, and I were Group 2. Steve, Jimmy, and Cecily were Group 3. And Meg, Terry, and Kitty were Group 4. 3 groups would investigate an area of the building while the last manned the control center. There wasn't a time limit involved, but if something began to happen in one place, we would converge and try to get the most coverage we could. Ken had the thermocam, and we'd set up night vision cameras all over the place. If anything happened, we would know about it. And we kind of needed to catch something after the letdown at the sanitarium. The food was done and delivered about 4:30, but we waited until Ken and Steve did a drink run to the nearest gas station. An overnight hunt doesn't run well without caffeine. It was around 5 when we all sat down and started eating. It was a fun meal, and it was good that everyone got on so well with one another. I could tell Steve was getting flummoxed by all the attention from both Meg and Terry, while Cecily and Kitty laughed at his predicament. Jamie, Alex, and I got along rather well, considering that we were the most soft-spoken of the group. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, we were loaded up and ready to roll. We started off in the kitchen. It was a fairly well-outfitted kitchen, which was in keeping with Perry Kolchak's history as a chef first and a restaurateur second. We did some EVP readings in the main room and then went into the walk-in. That was when things started going south. We heard a rapping in the walls before we even got all the way through the swinging doors. It was insistent and seemed to be reverberating in the far wall, punctuated with a far more forceful pounding like a sledgehammer. Alex and Jamie were looking suitably impressed that we'd gotten something worthwhile by 15 minutes into the hunt. But that feeling quickly evaporated when I rested an ear against the cold metal wall. People were shouting faintly in Cantonese, and there was an inescapable hiss of frying oil. The Lucky Dragon's kitchen shared a wall with the hole. No doubt we were just hearing them butchering a duck or a chicken. It was a bad job altogether, and we returned to the command center after recording more EVPs. I warned Kitty about the noise from the Lucky Dragon, and Group 4 shared a laugh. So far, no one had seen anything serious. Group 1 was outside, and Group 3 was in the basement. All was quiet, with nothing on the night vision either. Despite Lurch's warning, Ken and Steve had brought beer and hard cider from the gas station. So we partook and grazed on the leftover Chinese food. It was about 6:45 or 7 when the other 2 teams came back in with a whole lot of nothing. Group 1 needed to take over the command center since the thermos battery had drained fast. It was a fact that Ken hadn't known about until it crapped out in the middle of the parking lot. So we swapped around. My group ended up outside. There was a municipal parking lot behind the row of storefronts. This area was used for public parking, not only for the front stretch of businesses, but also for a group of one-story shops opposite the hole's back door. There was a discount furniture store, a CVS, and a bowling alley that had all seen better days. It really made me wonder if the parking lot had been around when the glory hole was open, since the disco floor had extended out double the length of the original storefront. It was definitely something to ask Miss Angie about, and she later told me that there wasn't a parking lot, just a dirt field. The play area was nice, covered in mulch chips. There was a swing set, slide, and ivy-lined trellis. It was still light out, so the place didn't have a spooky vibe. We didn't feel anything, but we recorded EVP just in case. We ended up sitting on the swings while Alex told us some of the stories about Cold Spring. More on this later. Alex is very knowledgeable about weird happenings around here. Sometime later, Steve's group came out and we swapped, returning to the command center first before heading downstairs. It was about 9 when we first stepped into the basement. The basement was clean, recently painted. Or at least it was before the hole was closed. And keg taps dangled sadly from the ceiling. The basement ran the full length of the restaurant and was made from thick stone blocks and bricks. At the far end, where the booths were upstairs, was a wide entryway that led under the Lucky Dragon and further down to the hidden dungeon area. A row of fluorescent bulbs flickered dimly in the rough-hewn room, and smaller doorways led to narrow, tall closets with metal vents in the ceilings. There were 4 rooms, and each was easily 8 feet tall, tapering up to metal pipes. It wasn't hard to imagine bootleggers brewing bathtub gin and moonshine in the claustrophobic stone cellar, or to imagine randy men trapped in the tall cubicles choking on smoke and water. The place gave me chills. And not just because the stone room was cold. Unlike the main basement, there was significant water staining and damage to the walls. The floor was dirt underneath a thin layer of plywood and linoleum, and 2 small puddles of dark, muddy water surrounded 2 sewer grates spaced equally along the floor. The room smelled of rot and earth and something sweeter that I didn't care to contemplate. I could tell that Jamie and Alex weren't too thrilled about spending too much time there, so we shined our flashlights in each cubicle, recorded about 10 minutes of EVP, snapped some chemical and digital photos, and then got out of there. We all got together and shared our findings before finishing off the food and drinks. The thermo was fully charged again, and Ken suggested that we go full dark with our NV cameras. It was a good idea, and we were committed to doing it overnight, so we prepped, went to the bathroom or outside to smoke, and then dove back in around midnight. Group 1 was investigating the kitchen. Group 3 was outside, and Group 4 was in the basement while we manned the table. The night vision cameras we'd set up in the basement were doing a pretty good job with a great view of the hidden room and of the main room at the bottom of the stairs. Despite not having much evidence, we were still in good spirits. The night was still young and we hadn't reached the witching hour. It was around 12:30 that I started seeing a fine fog creeping along the basement floor. Given that the day was hot and humid, and the night was a little more cool, and our close proximity to the lake, it was not exactly unexpected. I radioed Meg and asked if they saw it too. Terry responded that they saw it and that the mist was warm, that it was slowly creeping up from the drainage grates in the hidden room. It was around 1-ish when Alex grabbed my head and turned it to the monitor. It looked like Downey was pacing back and forth in front of the walk-in. So I responded while I pulled my head out of her grip. "He has restless legs," I said. She pointed in front of the table and my eyes followed her finger to show Group 1, Downey included, standing in front of the kitchen doors. My eyes darted back to the monitor and sure enough, someone was certainly still pacing. I looked to the side when the door to the parking lot opened and Group 3 walked in. We were all standing in the room, yet there was a person in the kitchen. Ken dashed into the kitchen with a crash. We saw him run around the service counter and straight through the man. "Did you see him?" Ken called on the radio. "He's right in front of you," someone shouted. "There's no one here. Do you see him on the monitor?" Ken replied. The figure, dressed in light-colored slacks and a dark t-shirt, stood stock still just behind Ken on the screen. "He's right on top of you!" someone screamed. On screen, Ken jumped up and spun around, waving the thermocam every which way. The figure disappeared. I'm not saying that it faded or popped out of existence. It just disappeared as if it never was there. And at that, the whole lot of us screamed as Ken blasted through the kitchen doors as white as a sheet. He immediately rewound the thermo, and we watched as the ambient warm hues of the kitchen swung around to a man-like shape of pure, purple cold before ending with the burning colors of our group gathered around the billowing heat of the command center. Ken and Steve whistled in appreciation before high fives were exchanged. This was real, verifiable evidence after only 7 hours. We were riding a high now, and we reorganized ourselves with renewed vigor. My group returned to the basement. The fog was halfway up to our shins. And that was just in the finished part of the basement. The unfinished part was about a foot further down. So, standing on the finished concrete floor, our legs completely disappeared. Terry was right, it was warm and moist enough to leave droplets on our clothes. "There's people in there," came Kitty's lowered voice from the radio. The three of us stopped barely a foot into the hidden room. I was in mid-step with my foot hanging in the air. "Where?" I asked. "They're standing in the doorways," was the reply. I looked around, but I didn't see anything on the night vision. I looked at Alex and Jamie. Both looked through their cameras and shook their heads. "Wait, they're moving towards you, real slow, right now," Kitty said. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, the fact that I was standing on one leg in the pitch dark with only a green glow of the camcorder to see overcame me. I could feel the blood in my arms and legs start thrumping. And then a faint pins and needle feeling began. The one you get when you're on the verge of throwing up or passing out. My right leg was starting to tremble and burn, but I didn't dare put my other foot down into the fog. The wet heat of it felt sweltering, but I was shivering with a chill that started at the bottom of my spine and ran straight to the top of my head. It felt like my hair was standing on end. I was losing the battle. "There are 6 of them. They're almost touching you." Kitty's whispered transmissions weren't exactly helping the situation. I looked through the viewfinder and I saw nothing but the fog and the darkness with the sheen of wet stone from the walls. The fog wasn't moving around us, so whatever she was seeing upstairs wasn't making physical contact. The bottom of my stomach had fallen out long before, but hearing they were so close was the last straw. I lifted the SLR camera around my neck and I slammed the shutter, swinging the lens around the room. Taking that as a signal, Alex and Jamie stepped back into the basement and ran upstairs. I was hot on their heels. Once we were back, I saw the playback from the cameras. 6 darkened silhouettes of people stepped out of the shadows of their cubicles as soon as we entered the rock cellar. There wasn't any sound, but I could see my arm swing the radio up when Kitty called. The shadow people converged slowly around, almost touching us, before the camera was blinded by the flash of my camera. The figures were gone when the lens recovered. Now, the stationary cameras were night vision, so why did they pick up the cameras and not the night vision on our handhelds? Why did we see the man in the kitchen, but Ken didn't? The figure was clearly there in the thermo, and we saw him on the monitor. Likewise, the shadow people were defined clearly in the basement, but we didn't catch anything, not even a swirl of fog. The figures in the basement were clearly shadow people as well. The man in the kitchen looked normal. I mean, we mistook him for one of us at first. But the shadows downstairs had no features, just black definition. At that point, Ken and Steve went on another drink run, bringing back whiskey and brandy. We didn't go back down to the hidden basement room again that night, and we turned on most of the lights. As soon as anyone stepped foot on the basement floor from the stairs, the shadows appeared in the other room. If you stood there long enough, they would stand at the doorway between the 2 rooms. But they never entered the finished side. My photos showed a panicked mix of gray fog and shadow, with nothing clear and certainly nothing human-shaped. Nothing happened for a long time after that. We were all frightened and excited, and the booze didn't help. It was just starting to get light out when Ken said that he was going back down to the basement with the thermo. I don't think that anyone thought that it was a good idea, but Ken treated it like it was a walk in the park, and I guess that was kind of infectious. reckless bravado got to us. No sooner had he stepped down onto the floor than the shadow people appeared in their alcoves. "Are you seeing them? The thermo's showing them as clear as day against the fog." Ken's voice was a little bit shaky. "We see them," Downey responded. "They're moving to the doorway." Despite our cries of disbelief and alarm, Ken stepped towards the doorway. The shadows remained still. "They don't have any definition, just an outline, and they're uniformly cold." Ken stopped about 2 feet away from the edge of the cellar. "This is incredible. They're absolutely invisible to the naked eye." Suddenly, a smaller, thinner shadow sprouted from the middle of the basement floor, barely a foot from Ken, pulling itself along the floor like Sadeko from The Ring. "Get out! There's one behind you!" someone screamed. Ken spun around and looked down for a fraction of an instant and dashed through the apparition and up the stairs. After that, we decided to start packing up and get out of there as soon as Lirch arrived at 6. Around 5 o'clock, the fog started receding, either back into the drainage grates or up the bootlegger chimneys. We made sure that the fog was gone before we retrieved the cameras in the basement rooms.